Hi sweet friends, it's Betty here from Easy Bloom Garden. If you're tired of looking at bare patches of soil turn into one weed problem after another, you are absolutely not alone. Some spots in the garden seem to stay open for 5 minutes before something wild pops right back up. That can get frustrating fast, especially when you want a yard that feels pretty peaceful and easier to care for. Today, we're talking about some wonderful low-growing plants that can spread out, fill those empty spaces, and help make weeding much less of a constant chore. A few of these are great for sunny spots, some do beautifully in shade, and all of them can help your garden look fuller and more finished without so much hard work. So grab your gloves, get comfortable, and let's talk about a few lovely ground covers that can help your garden do more of the work for you. Nothing makes a garden feel harder to manage than looking out at a bare patch of soil and knowing exactly what is coming next. You pull a few weeds, clean the area up, and for a brief moment it looks tidy. Then a week or two passes, and that open space starts filling right back in. First it is a few thin sprouts, then it becomes a whole patch of unwanted growth. That seems to multiply faster than anything you actually planted on purpose. That cycle gets exhausting fast, especially if you are trying to save your back, your knees, and your weekends for something better than constant weeding. If that sounds familiar, subscribe and keep this channel close by. Because simple garden choices like these can save a lot of work and still make your yard look full and cared for. The real problem is not always the weeds themselves. Very often, the problem is empty ground. Bare soil is like an open invitation. Sun reaches the ground and it hits it directly. Rain hits it, weed seeds land on it, and before long, nature starts covering that space with whatever grows the fastest. If you do not fill that soil with something useful, something wild usually steps in and does the job for you. That is why ground covers can be such a smart answer. They help shade the soil, slow down weed growth, soften harsh, empty spots, and make the garden feel more finished, without asking for the same level of upkeep as a large bed full of demanding plants. That does not mean every ground cover works everywhere, and it does not mean you can plant one and forget it forever. The best ones still need the right light, the right soil, and a little patience while they settle in. Still, once they get going, many of them can make a huge difference in places where weeds used to win every year. Some are better for hot, sunny spots. Others are much happier in shade. A few spread quickly, which can be a gift in one area and a headache in another. Choosing well matters. One of the nicest choices for sunny, open ground is creeping thyme. This plant earns its place because it stays low, smells wonderful when brushed or stepped on, and slowly forms a soft mat that helps cover exposed soil. It is especially useful between stepping stones, along path edges, in gravelly areas, or in those thin, dry strips where taller plants always look a bit awkward. Instead of a patch that turns scruffy and weed-filled, creeping thyme can give you a neat green carpet with tiny flowers that pollinators love. It also suits the kind of gardener who does not want to fuss too much. Once established, creeping thyme often handles dry conditions better than many other ground-hugging plants. That makes it a strong pick for sunny places where the hose does not always reach easily, or where you simply do not want another thirsty plant on your list. The texture is low and tidy, and the flowers add a soft burst of color, without turning the plant into something high maintenance or overly delicate. There are a few things to watch with it, though. Creeping thyme is not the plant for soggy soil or deep shade. In a damp area, it can struggle. In a dark corner, it usually will not fill in the way you hoped. It likes good drainage and plenty of sun. It also tends to establish more steadily than aggressively, so you may need a little patience in the first season. Mulching lightly between young plants can help keep weeds down while it spreads. Have you ever tried thyme as a ground cover or only as an herb in a pot? Many gardeners are surprised by how useful it can be outside the herb bed. If creeping thyme is a good match for dry, sunny spots, creeping jenny offers a very different kind of beauty. This one is grown as much for its bright trailing color as for its ability to cover soil. The leaves are small, rounded, and cheerful, often glowing in a yellow-green shade that brightens beds, container edges, and damp corners where plain soil would otherwise stand out. It can look especially pretty spilling over a stone border, softening the edge of a raised bed, or weaving around other plants in a place that needs a fuller look. Creeping Jenny is often a strong choice where the soil stays a bit more moist. It tends to be happier than thyme in places that are not bone dry all summer. That makes it useful around downspouts, pond edges, or beds that get regular watering. It can also work well in containers, where its trailing habit helps pots look fuller and more relaxed. In the right setting, it spreads well enough to help crowd out some of the weed pressure that takes over open ground. Still, this is one of those plants that needs a little common sense. In some gardens and some climates, Creeping Jenny spreads very enthusiastically. That can be helpful if your goal is to cover space quickly, but less helpful if you want a plant that stays politely in a tiny border. It is worth checking how it behaves in your area before planting a large patch. A ground cover that saves work should not create a new problem you have to fight later. Used in the right place, though, it can be a simple, colorful answer for open soil that always seems to look unfinished. These first two plants already show how much the right ground cover depends on the conditions you have. One likes sun and sharper drainage, the other is happier with more moisture and a little room to roam. That contrast becomes even more useful when the garden shifts away from open, sunny ground and into those awkward shaded spots where weeds seem to creep in quietly and stay put. That contrast becomes even more useful when the garden shifts away from open, sunny ground and into those awkward shaded spots where weeds seem to creep in quietly and stay put. Those areas need a different kind of plant, and a few of the best options are perfect for that. Shady parts of the yard can be some of the most frustrating places to keep tidy. Grass often thins out there, flowers can look sparse, and bare soil has a way of turning into a quiet hiding place for weeds before you even notice what is happening. These are the areas under shrubs, along fence lines, beside the house, or beneath trees where the ground never seems to stay neat for long. The good news is that a few ground covers handle those tougher corners beautifully, and they can make the garden feel softer, fuller, and much easier to manage. A lovely plant to start with is sweet woodruff. This one is especially useful if you want a ground cover that looks gentle and light rather than thick and heavy. Its leaves form a soft green layer, and in spring it produces small white flowers that give shady beds a fresh, airy look. Sweet woodruff works especially well under shrubs, along woodland-style paths, and in those cooler spots where sun-loving plants never really settle in. If you have a bed that feels a little empty under larger plants, this is the kind of ground cover that can knit everything together and make the whole area look intentional. What makes it helpful in a low-maintenance garden is the way it gradually fills space, without needing constant trimming or fussing. It is not usually the fastest or wildest spreader, but it can create a calm, even carpet over time. That matters in shade, where weeds often sneak into the open pockets between larger plants. A fuller surface means less room for unwanted growth to get started. Sweet woodruff also has a softer, more natural look than some dense evergreen ground covers, so it suits gardens that lean relaxed rather than formal. There are still a few limits to keep in mind. Sweet woodruff tends to be happiest in moist, well-drained soil, with real shade or dappled light. In hot, dry ground, especially under thirsty trees, it can struggle and thin out. If your shade is also very dry, you may need something tougher. Still, in the right conditions, it can be a graceful answer to those shady problem areas that always seem unfinished. Do you have more trouble with sunny weeds or shady weeds in your yard? The answer usually tells you a lot about which plants will save you the most work. Another excellent choice for shade to part sun is ajuga, often called bugleweed. This plant is useful in a very different way. Where sweet woodruff looks soft and woodland-like, ajuga tends to look denser, richer, and more dramatic. Many varieties have deep green, bronze, or purple-toned leaves, so even when it is not blooming, it adds strong color close to the ground. In spring, it sends up spikes of blue, violet, or purplish flowers that brighten the bed and bring in pollinators. If you want a ground cover that does more than just fill space, ajuga can bring real visual interest to difficult areas. It is especially handy where grass refuses to cooperate. Under small trees, near shady walkways, or along the front edge of a border, ajuga can spread into a low mat that helps shade the soil and reduce open spots where weeds take hold. It also tends to look fuller faster than some slower plants, which makes it satisfying if you are trying to improve the look of a bare patch without waiting forever. The leaf color alone can make a shady area feel more alive. The caution with ajuga is not that it is difficult, but that it can travel farther than you expected if it likes the conditions. In a bed, that may be exactly what you want. Near a lawn edge, it can turn into a plant you end up pulling out of the grass. Good placement matters. This is why choosing the right spot is so important. It also prefers decent drainage, even though it enjoys more moisture than drought-loving sun plants. In soggy or crowded spots with poor airflow, it may not stay as healthy as it should. Used carefully, though, it is one of the best ways to cover shady soil with something attractive instead of letting weeds own the space. For an even more traditional, evergreen look, Pachysandra has been a dependable answer in shady gardens for years. This is the plant many people picture when they think of a classic carpet beneath trees or along a foundation. It forms a thick mat of green leaves that stays present through much of the year, which helps a bed look structured and settled even in quieter seasons. That evergreen quality can be a real advantage if you want the garden to hold its shape and not fall flat the moment flowering plants fade. Pachysandra is especially useful in those broad, hard-to-fill stretches where you need coverage more than color. Under mature shrubs, beside shaded walls, or in a side yard where nothing else seems happy, it can do the simple job of covering the ground and limiting weed opportunities. That may not sound exciting, but in the right place, practical plants are often the most valuable ones. A bed that stays green and covered with little effort can save a surprising amount of work over the years. Still, Pachysandra is not the perfect answer for every garden. Some types are a better fit than others depending on your region, and in certain places it can spread more than you want. Airflow matters too, especially in dense shade. If the planting is too crowded and stays damp, disease can become a problem. It is also more useful for solid coverage than for floral beauty, so it fits best where your main goal is weed suppression and a clean look. In the right setting, though, it can do that job extremely well. These shade-loving plants prove that a difficult corner does not have to stay difficult forever. Some bring softness, some bring color, and some simply get the job done with a steady green carpet. Shade asks for a different strategy than full sun, and that difference becomes even clearer when you move back into the hottest, brightest parts of the yard, where the ground bakes, weeds sprout fast, and only the tougher spreaders really hold their ground. Sunny, bare soil can be just as frustrating as shade, only in a completely different way. Instead of dealing with thin grass and quiet little weeds creeping through cool corners, you are dealing with heat, glare, dry patches, and plants that either burn out or never fill in fast enough to help. These are the spots along driveways, sunny borders, slopes, rock edges, and open beds, where the ground seems to bake all afternoon. The right ground cover can make a huge difference there, but it has to be the kind of plant that can handle bright light, lean soil, and a little neglect without falling apart. A very strong choice for those conditions is sedum, often called stonecrop. This is one of the best plants for gardeners who want coverage without bringing in something needy. Sedum works because it stores water in its leaves, which means it can often handle dry spells better than softer, thirstier plants. That makes it especially useful in hot spots where watering all the time is unrealistic. If you have a strip beside a walkway, a dry slope, a gravelly bed, or a sunny patch where other plants keep disappointing you, sedum is worth serious attention. Another reason sedum earns its place is that there are different kinds for different looks. Some stay very low and creep across the soil like a living mat. Others mound slightly but still help cover open ground and shade the roots below. The leaf colors can range from fresh green to blue-green, silver, or even reddish tones, so the plant can add interest even when it is not flowering. Some varieties bloom with clusters of tiny flowers. which can be a bonus for pollinators and bring a little movement and color into a spot that might otherwise feel flat. The care is refreshingly simple. Sedum likes sun and it likes soil that drains well. In fact, soil that is too rich or too wet can be more of a problem than poor soil. This is not the plant for a soggy bed or a low pocket where water sits after rain. In the right place, though, it can help solve a problem that many gardeners know too well: ground that dries out so quickly that it seems impossible to keep anything looking decent there. Have you got a spot in your yard that always seems too hot, too dry, or too bright for ordinary plants? That is often exactly where stonecrop starts to shine. For a sunnier ground cover with a more showy spring performance, creeping phlox is hard to ignore. This plant is loved for the way it can spill over an edge or spread across a sunny bank and suddenly cover the area in flowers. When it blooms, it creates that kind of blanket effect people notice right away. Pink, lavender, white, bluish, and rosy tones can turn a plain slope or border into one of the prettiest parts of the yard. Even after the flowers pass, the low evergreen or semi-evergreen foliage still helps keep the soil more covered than a bare patch would be. Creeping phlox is especially helpful on slopes, at the front of borders, near retaining walls, or in any sunny place where you want a softer edge and fewer exposed gaps for weeds to move into. It gives you beauty and function at the same time, which is a big win in a low-maintenance garden. A plant that helps hold a bank, fills open space, and brings a burst of color without needing constant pampering is doing real work. It does have its preferences. Creeping phlox usually wants good drainage and plenty of light. In heavy wet soil, it can struggle, especially through colder or wetter seasons. It also benefits from a bit of tidying after bloom if you want it to stay neat and encourage dense growth. That light cleanup is usually a fair trade for the color and coverage it brings. If your goal is to make a sunny patch look cared for instead of scraggly, this plant can do a lot with relatively little fuss. Another sun-loving plant that helps fill bare soil in a very different visual way is lamb's ear. This one is not always the fastest spreader on the list, but it earns attention because of its texture and drought tolerance. The leaves are soft, silvery, and almost velvety, which gives the garden a calmer, cooler look even in harsh summer light. That silver tone can also be surprisingly useful in design. It helps brighten a border, break up all green planting, and make dry, sunny areas feel more intentional rather than neglected. Lamb's ear is especially nice in sunny front borders, dry edging, and cottage-style beds. It's perfect for places where you want foliage interest, even when flowers are not the main focus. It can spread into clumps that slowly widen and cover more ground over time, helping reduce those open pockets where weeds like to settle. It is also a plant that children and guests often notice because the leaves are so touchable, which gives it a bit of personality beyond simple weed suppression. Its caution is mostly about moisture. Lamb's ear dislikes wet feet and can rot if it sits in soggy soil or crowded damp conditions. The flower stalks can also look untidy after blooming, so some gardeners trim them for a cleaner look. Even with that small bit of cleanup, it remains a very useful low-care plant for sunny areas where softer green plants often fade or flop. The silver leaves also pair beautifully with hotter flower colors nearby, so it can make the whole bed look more finished. These three plants show that sunny ground covers do not all solve the same problem in the same way. Sedum is tough and drought-friendly. Creeping phlox brings stronger seasonal color and slope coverage. Lamb's ear offers texture, softness, and a dry climate look that can calm a bright bed down. The common thread is that each one helps give the soil a job to do besides growing weeds. That simple shift can change how a whole section of the yard feels. Still, even a strong list of sunny and shady spreaders does not answer every problem spot.
Some areas sit in dry shade under trees, where sun lovers fail, and moisture-loving shade plants thin out. That is where the final plant on this list becomes especially valuable, because it handles a combination of conditions that can make gardeners feel like nothing will ever cover the ground properly. Some of the hardest ground to cover is not out in blazing sun or in a cool, moist corner, It is that awkward, dry shade under trees, beside large shrubs, or along the side of the house where roots steal moisture. Light is limited, and weeds still seem to find a way in. These are the places that make gardeners feel like nothing truly wants to grow there except the things they do not want. That is exactly why barrenwort, also called epimedium, deserves a place on this list.
It is not the flashiest plant at first glance, and it is not usually the fastest either, but it handles a difficult combination of conditions that very few plants manage well. Barrenwort earns its place because it can settle into dry shade and slowly create the kind of living cover that makes those stubborn problem spots feel manageable again. The leaves are often heart-shaped or gently pointed, and many varieties have a graceful look. That feels much lighter than a thick, heavy ground cover. Some have fresh bronze or reddish tones when new growth appears, which adds a little seasonal beauty even before the plant starts filling in more seriously. The flowers are small but charming, often floating above the foliage in spring like delicate little stars or spurs. This is a plant for patience rather than instant results. If you want a ground cover that races across a bed in one season, barrenwort may feel too calm for you. But if you want something dependable for a place where other plants keep failing, it starts to look much more impressive. Under established trees, in the dry shade near roots, or along the base of shrubs where the soil never stays richly moist for long, barrenwort can hold its own far better than many softer woodland plants. That reliability matters. A plant does not need to be dramatic to be incredibly useful. Its care is fairly simple after establishment. It appreciates some water while settling in, and a little compost around it can help at planting time, but it does not ask for rich pampering forever. In fact, its value comes from being able to live in those less than ideal spaces, where you are tired of trying expensive solutions that never last. The main caution is simply this: give it time. It is a long-term helper, not an overnight fix. If you plant it expecting instant coverage, you may be disappointed too early. If you plant it for the years ahead, it can be one of the smartest choices in the garden. That brings up something important about all 9 ground covers in this list. The best one is not the one with the prettiest photo at the nursery. The best one is the one that matches the conditions you actually have. A ground cover that thrives in hot, dry sun may fail completely in moist shade. A plant that beautifully fills a woodland edge might fry beside a driveway. A quick spreader may be perfect for a large, rough patch, but far too aggressive for a tiny, formal bed. Choosing the right match matters more than choosing the trendiest name. A simple way to narrow it down is to ask a few basic questions. First, is the area mostly sun or mostly shade? That one answer removes half your options right away. Creeping thyme, sedum, creeping phlox, and lamb's ear make more sense for brighter areas. Sweet woodruff, ajuga, pachysandra, and barrenwort are better candidates for shade. Creeping jenny can bridge certain conditions, especially where moisture is more consistent, but it still needs careful placement. Second, is the soil dry or does it stay moist? Dry shade is very different from moist shade. Hot, dry sun is different from a bed that gets regular irrigation. The closer you match the plant to the moisture pattern, the less work you create for yourself later. Third, what kind of look do you actually want? Some gardeners care most about flowers. Others want evergreen coverage. Others simply want to stop seeing raw soil and pulling weeds every weekend. There is no wrong answer, but being honest about your goal helps you choose more wisely. A good planting plan also makes a huge difference. Even the best ground cover will struggle if it starts life buried in weeds and compacted soil. The first step is to clear the area as thoroughly as you can. That does not mean making the soil perfect, but it does mean giving your new plants a fair chance. Pull or dig out existing weeds, especially the deep-rooted ones that will come right back through young ground covers. If the soil is hard, loosening it a bit and mixing in a small amount of compost can help roots settle more quickly. Spacing matters too. Planting too far apart is one of the most common reasons a ground cover project feels disappointing. Wide gaps leave room for weeds to move back in before the plants connect. You do not need to crowd them so tightly that they smother each other, but you do want them close enough that coverage feels realistic within a reasonable time. A light layer of mulch between young plants can also help during the early months. It reduces open soil, helps with moisture, and gives your chosen plants time to spread without constant competition. The first season is the most important. Watering during establishment can make the difference between a ground cover that slowly takes hold and one that stalls out. After that, many of these plants become much easier to manage. There may still be occasional weeding, trimming, or guiding a wandering edge back into place, but the workload usually drops compared with maintaining empty soil that keeps inviting trouble. If this gave you a few easier ideas for your own yard, subscribe for more practical gardening help that keeps things simple, beautiful, and far less tiring. The real secret to less weeding is not fighting bare soil forever. It is giving that soil something better to do. When the right ground cover settles in, the garden starts helping you back. Open patches begin to look finished, beds feel calmer. Weeds lose some of the easy space they used to claim. And little by little, the yard starts looking fuller and easier to keep up with, without demanding so much of your time, your energy, or your knees.